Hello, welcome back to Business Intelligence. It's this time of the week we'll talk about the content of this course. This week will be the last main chapter of this course. This is because of the COVID-19 emergency. I have restructured the course. Therefore, I have removed what usually is the last chapter of this course, which is association rules or market basket analysis. We will not do that. Therefore, today's content is about clustering, and this will be the final chapter of this course. And by the way, please excuse the kids playing outside background. They are not my kids. They are my beautiful neighbors' kids. Excuse them. They deserve some little fun. And last week I sent out an email asking for feedback about this course. I got very useful feedback. Thank you so much if you have responded to my email. If you haven't, please send me your informal evaluation of this course that I asked for you to do. These will be really helpful for me to continue to adapt to this special time and to make the course experience better for you. So one of the very useful feedback that I got from you is that some of you said the videos I upload these couple of weeks tend to be a little bit long, and it's hard, it's hard to manage the time. The total length of the videos are not actually long, compared to the lectures, the face-to-face lectures that we would have. But I know that a lot of times you will need to refer to the videos of previous semesters on the same hands-on topic, just to make sure that you got it right and you practice enough about those topics, and that is really appreciated. The fact that you're checking, you're watching the same hands-on topic over several different videos and over several different semesters is really good. I think those times of watching the demonstrations will be really helpful in in familiarizing yourself with the SAS software on that relevant topics. So I'll do my best here in this video. I'll do my best to shorten the length. I will keep on the point. I will demonstrate the key points, and when I don't need to demonstrate the hands-on, I will refer you to the relevant parts of the previous semester's videos, so that you don't have to spend so much time on somewhat redundant hands-on demonstrations, but really get the job done in the most efficient way. So that said, today's video has three parts. In the first section, I'll briefly talk about the key points of clustering algorithm on the conceptual side. I will use k-means clustering as the algorithm to dive in, and then I will leave the other types of clustering algorithms, including hierarchical clustering algorithm. I'll leave them for your own self-reading of the chapter. In the second section, I'll talk about the hands-on part, the hands-on exercise of k-means clustering, but I won't do any demonstration here because in the previous semester's videos, the hands-on practice have been demonstrated in detail adequately, so you can simply refer to those videos. I do have a few important comments about how to make best use of those resources, so I'll talk about that in the second section. In the third section, I'll briefly talk about this week's homework, the final homework of this semester, homework 8, and I will specifically talk about one of the hands-on question, one of the hands-on practice question in the homework, so that you can, you know the context of that question and know how to answer them in the best way that you can. All right, let's go. Okay, now let's begin the first part of today's lecture. As you can see here, I've opened the slideshow. Please download the slideshow if you haven't. Today's topic is clustering or cluster model, or cluster analysis. It's the specific type of the cluster model that I would delve into is the k-means cluster, and I will skip the hierarchical clustering algorithm for your own reading. Now, as you know, so far I have mostly talked about, and you have mostly practiced supervised learning, and clustering is not supervised learning. Clustering algorithm is unsupervised learning. Now, you guys know that the key difference between the two, supervised versus unsupervised learning, is the presence of a target variable. You know, supervised learning does have a target variable specified, but unsupervised learning does not have a target variable specified. So without a target variable, what can you do with the data? You know, even without target variable, you can still find some kind of patterns in the input data space. You know, the sometimes dozens of input variables provided about the subject or object of interest to the business, and based on the numerical values or sometimes categorical labels of those input variables, you can still kind of, you know, you can separate those cases based on their information, as if, you know, you can quite intuitively separate groups of people based on their credit risks, you know, based on the information that you know about their consumption behaviors. How the way people spend money and manage their money and savings and assets tells a lot about their credit risk. In fact, the credit scores are mostly based on the way that they spend their money and save their money and manage their asset. So that's an analogy. Clustering is trying to separate the population of the subject of interest into several or a few number. It cannot be too large, otherwise it becomes unmanageable, and clustering makes no sense. The purpose of clustering is to separate or segment the population of interest into a fairly small number of groups. The differences between the groups should be large, whereas the similarities between the cases within a group should be large. So to put the objective formally, clustering algorithm have this ultimate objective is to, for the cases between or across the clusters, cluster 1, cluster 2, their similarity should be maximized, or in another way to say it, this similarity, the differences should be maximized. Whereas if you zoom in to individual cases within this cluster number 1, the similarities between the cases should be maximized, whereas the dissimilarity or the difference should be minimized. Difference should be minimized. So that would be the purpose. There are two parallel purposes, but they follow the same logic. Why do we need it? Because sometimes we don't have the target variable. Target variable is unavailable, and sometimes the target variable is not of a high quality. You can come up with an alternative target variable by using the clustering algorithm. So clustering algorithm does provide you some unique information about the groups, even if there is a defined target variable there. Clustering variable can answer a slightly different question and come up with a slightly different target variable that provides useful information. Now, to sort of illustrate the idea behind clustering algorithm, the key logic behind how clustering algorithm does its job. Let's do a fun game. Hopefully you find fun in this game. You won't be able to see these slides in your in the slides that you download from PowerPoint, because this part is reserved for me to go through in the class or in this video. So here I have an object of interest. There are several different kinds of the same object in the population. I won't give you any hint here about what they are. Just use your imagination. But there's some information here. Each of the objects, even if regardless of the type, the grouping, the types, the groups are the purpose of the clustering. It is the purpose of this game. You are to guess the different types. What are they? And ultimately, what is the object of interest? Now, regardless of the type or the groups, each one of them can still put on this two-way scatter plot here. The two key variables or key measures to describe the object is the weight in terms of the gram and the density of the material. When I say material, it does preclude the case from being the object being animals. You can't measure animals by density, and then humans or any organic parts. So you can't do that really. So it's an object. But that's still leaves a lot of possibilities here. So you can describe each instance of the object by or each kind of the object by two measures: the gram and density. Density would typically mean gram per volume. So here, based on the essence of clustering is to segment the groups based on how different the cases are between each other on key measures. Based on these two key measures, and based on how the different instances of the object locate on this scatter plot, it seems to be the case that gram is more useful in segmenting the cases than density. This might not be true, but it seems to be the way. So based on the differences in grams, there's a segment that falls between 2 and 3 grams, and there's another segment that falls between 4 and 7 grams. So there seems to be two segments. So can you guess based on this information, can you guess what the object is? What is the object that typically weighs between 2 and 7 grams, but they are separated into 2 segments? There's a smaller kind and there's a bigger kind. What could it be? What could it be? Computer? No, it's too heavy. So what else can it be? Think about it. We see 2 clusters. Is it really true? Now, we do have a third measure because the way because of the way scatter plot can work. We can only show 2-dimensional plot, but it turns out to be that while the weight is informative, it separates, 2 groups, smaller than 3.5 or lighter than 3.5 gram or heavier than 3.5 gram. But by using density, it doesn't help too much. However, when we use diameter, it seems to be round. The object is round. By using diameter, we do see a little bit more nuanced picture of the other group, the heavier group, that they seem to further separate into 2 groups, although not by too much difference in terms of gram. Their diameters, on average, they are different by somewhat 1/8 or 1/9. The average of the 2 clusters are different by 1/9. So we kind of see 3 groups here by using another diameter. It seems to be that, so the conclusion is that diameter is a more informative attribute to separate at least these 2 groups. Or actually, by using diameter, it effectively separates the 3 groups. And in this case, even without using weight, we can kind of see a boundary between the 3 clusters. Diameter is better able to separate cluster 2 and 3. So based on this information, we see 3 clusters definitely by using 2 informative attributes. Both of them are uniquely informative for clustering the groups. So what can this object be? Now, since we know that diameter is a more useful attribute to cluster the groups, and looking back, if we plot back the objects by using density again, we can't separate by using the density alone. We essentially cannot do anything to separate the groups. Using weight, we can separate the 2 big clusters, but using diameter, we can further separate the heavier group into 2 clusters. And here the color is actually using density, or by using the cutoff point of the density to plot the 2 groups, to separate the 2 groups. So now we have 3 groups here that are in the relevant ranges of the weight and density. What can you guess about these objects? These objects are very light. Each of them is very light. There are at least 3 clusters. There are actually 4 common types, but the 4th one would essentially be indistinguishable here by using these measures. So I didn't plot the 4th one. So what can it be? Now I'm going to reveal the answer in 5 seconds. So think about it if you still enjoy, you know, the curiosity of trying to guess what this is. Okay, I'm gonna review the answer. Yeah, it's coins. Hopefully it's interesting. As for coins, we have the quarter being the heaviest and with the highest diameter. They form a cluster. And we have nickels. We have nickel is smaller and less and slightly lighter than quarters, but definitely larger, and definitely larger and heavier than the other two groups. But here, you know, I'm actually using two colors to plot the two types, but they are so closely related. It's different. It's so difficult to separate them simply by using these measures, even including diameter. But in order to separate these two groups that are highly similar, you would need the actual symbols on a coin to separate them out. Alright, I hope you guys enjoy this game, but essentially the purpose of the game is to illustrate how cluster algorithm did its job in separating the clusters, and the result of this clustering exercise actually conformed to our knowledge about the different types of coins. So clustering does have some ability to conform to reveal answers that conform to our knowledge. But in the world of unknown problem, unknown solution, clustering would be even more important in guiding us to be able to see different groups. You know, the cases between groups are heterogeneous. The groups are heterogeneous across each other, but within each of those groups, the cases are homogeneous within each of the cluster. Okay, now I'll talk about the demo in the second section, in the second part of this video. The demo will focus on a new data set. It's about or a data set that appeared last week, I think, but here it's the census data. Well, actually, this is a new data set. The census data. Census data is enormous, you know, and this is only a small subset of the data set, but it's also large. And in this data set, the task is to use only a few variables about the neighborhood properties of the different neighborhoods across. This is actually 30,000 neighborhoods, not people, but neighborhood. And the task is to cluster these many of neighborhoods into a few number of clusters of different neighborhoods and to profile them. And this is kind of revealing some of the solutions of profiling. And here I illustrate a format of how to describe the profile. You know, how to describe profiles, so you can have, you know, 5 clusters, and each of the cluster can be described about their profile by using the information that are illustrated or plotted in these graphs. In the videos of previous semesters about cluster profile, you will learn how to do that, so just be patient. And your region, density, percentile, median household income, these variables will appear in your cluster profiles. You are using these variables and how they compare to other clusters and the entire population to describe the uniqueness about a specific cluster. Median household income and also average household size. I hope this will make sense. I'll come back to this just a little bit. So I will continue to talk about clustering. Now, to reiterate, the purpose of clustering algorithm, they are trying to achieve a higher between cluster variation. So it has to be large. That will indicate you know, all of these three arrows lines here between cluster. This is the cluster boundary of different clusters. The algorithm is trying to enlarge or maximize, you know, the thickness of this line is to maximize the distances, is to maximize the differences represented by the distances of the centers of different clusters. It's a between cluster variation, but at the same time, it's trying to shrink, it's trying to minimize, you know, within the cluster, to minimize the similarities, you know, the distances or similarities between the cases. So within cluster variation will be small for within cluster simulation, but variation. So how does it do it? To clarify a myth here, or a misconception, it doesn't change the distance, or it doesn't change the data. You know, the algorithm doesn't change the data. It's not that it changes the data, and by means of that, it changes the variations and changes the distances. It doesn't, but it tries to come up with a solution that draws boundaries in a way that can maximize the resultant clusters differences between each other, and also reduces the differences of cases within each of the clusters. So that's what it does. Now, obviously, you probably have, you know, thought about that. K means cluster, bears a similar name to an earlier algorithm that we talked about, which is a K nearest neighbor algorithm, or we typically use it to for classification tasks. So K means and K and N, are they the same? They're definitely not the same. One is unsupervised, this is unsupervised. K nearest neighbor classifier is a supervised method, just because of the purposes that they fulfill. But also they do bear some similarities. The similarity is the key aspect of the algorithm. They both use distances between cases to identify solutions. In K nearest neighbor algorithm, distances are used to select the K nearest neighbors. In K means cluster, distances are used to distances are used to cluster and temporarily cluster or segment the cases so that the center of cluster can be updated. Then in the next iteration, based on the recalculated cluster centroids, the segmentation or the cluster ownership of the points are recalculated and updated until the algorithm can converge. So just to be short, the similarity measure plays a key role in both of these algorithms. But nevertheless, the two algorithms are still different. They fulfill the different purposes. And as you have expected, Euclidean distance would be the same classic distance measure or distance formula under each. And since we're on this topic, And because distance is used as a key measure of progressing with the algorithm, something that you must do before you analyze the data, during the data pre-processing stage, would be to, I'm sure you know, excellent, I know you know it, key is to standardize or normalize all variables. Why? Because if you don't, the arbitrary scale of some of the variables will bias the solution, so that in the end, those variables will play an important role where in ground truth, those variables shouldn't play such a big role here. Every variable should be fair. You should be fair to every variable. You should allow the true variations, not the artificial, arbitrary scales, play a big role. You should allow the variations to surface under a normalized scenario. Right, and here standardization or normalization doesn't mean to make the distribution normal. That is not the job of standardization or normalization. Standardization or normalization simply fulfills the job of keeping the scales, the unit size of each of the variables to be the same. Under standardization, each unit change should correspond to one standard deviation of that variable's original scale, so that after standardization, we can put the points on a square 2x2 plane, and the variations correspond to our visual sides. I will talk more about it when I talk about a specific problem here. And here, Euclidean distance can be calculated by means of the formula. If and there are different types. No, I will not talk about this. Cut this slide. Okay, let me talk briefly about the procedure of k-means clustering. This is how computers go through iteration by iteration in the background. In each iteration, or in the beginning of the algorithm, it first asks for a number of k. You must indicate this k, even though algorithm will have some other measures to indicate what might be the optimal number of k. And this is in slight difference with the k nearest neighbor algorithm. In k and n algorithm will not even indicate to you what is a best guess for the optimal k, because in that case that is supervised modeling. Here it's unsupervised model. It does analyze the variations in the data set and try to tell you what might be an optimal level of k. After having the k, algorithm will first generate or randomly pick k number of points from the entire data set as the beginning point for the centers of for the center of each of the clusters. Remember, you need to pick a k, and k points are selected, and they are artificially artificially recognized as the beginning point of the center of the 1-point cluster, so forth. And then the next step is to calculate from each point, to calculate the distance between each of the points with each of the center of the cluster. And now the center of the cluster are the k randomly selected point in the step 2. And after the distances are calculated, the shortest distance among all the cluster centers from one point is selected, and that cluster ownership is decided in this iteration. Now next, after you go through all the points in this iteration, cluster centroids are updated because now the clusters have more points, and those points, based on their location, they are able to update the center of that cluster. And after that update of the centroid of cluster, then step 3 will be repeated, and then step 4, and then update, and then step 3 and 4. So step 3 and 4 and 5 will be repeated. Step 5 is simply says it goes back to step 3. So that's what step 5 does. But also step 5 also checks the stopping criteria. If the ownership of the cluster or the cluster centroid does not change at all, the algorithm is converged. So question, during the model analysis, what happens to a cluster when a new data point is added to that cluster? Now, to answer this question, if a new point is newly joins a cluster that previously has, let's say, 10 points, so those 10 points will construct the center of that cluster. If in case a new point joins that cluster, then based on the location of that new point, it inevitably would very likely change the center of, the geometric center of the cluster. Then the result here would be that the cluster centroid will be updated. Okay, how to update the centroid? So let's say that you have you have n number of points here, and you have several variables. We have variable A, B, C, and this list can go on and on. A, B, C. It can go to a very high dimension. Here, can go more. It can be more than Z. And the way to update the centroid is to update on each of the dimension across all the points. So for variable A, it calculates the arithmetic center by using this sum divided by the number of total cases. So this is arithmetic center of dimension A and dimension B, and so on and so on. So the calculation process is actually not very heavy. Even if you have many dimensions, it's only calculating the arithmetic center of those points. Okay, now here comes the fun part. By using 8 data points, I'm going to illustrate to you by hand what does the computer go through, and also how does cluster algorithm figure out the clustering effectively, and to evaluate how quickly does the algorithm, by following the steps, how quickly does the algorithm figure out the correct clustering. And these 8 points should illustrate the point, because this will make humans proud. Because by human's eye, it's very easy to figure out the solution. And let me show you. So here I have, each of the point has, let's say, 2 dimensions. We can say A and B. And on this two-dimensional plane, I'm going to designate x-axis as A and y-axis as B. So each of the data will be represented by a point on this 2D plane. So, and take a look at these points. 0, 3 on the B line, 0, 2 on the B line, 0, 1 on the B line, 1, 2 not far from the B line, 2, 0 is on the A line because the value of B is 0. 2, 0, 3, 0, and 4, 0. All of them are on the B line, on the A line. Sorry, and point 4, 1 is not far from the A line, but far from the B line. So let me use a different color here. Let me use green to put these points on the plane. So I have a 0, 1 is this point, and I have 0, 2 is this point, then I have 0, 3. They are somewhat equally distanced. Hopefully I did a good job in drawing these. 0, 3, and I have 1, 2. 1 here, 2 should be here. So now I finished these 4 points, and for these 4 points, 2, 0, 3, 0, and 4, 0. So I have 1, 2, 2, 0, 3 should be here, 3, 0, 4 will be here, 4, 0, and 4, 1 should be at the same height of this point. Alright, so I have placed these 4 points on the 2D dimension here, and this will make humans proud because your eyes will tell you that, let me use black here, or let me use red here. Your eyes will tell you solution is obvious. You know, if I draw a line to separate the two groups, and these would be it. You know, this would be one group, and that would be one group, 2 clusters. You know, and I, as a human, I didn't even have to calculate. My eyes tell me that is a solution. You know, it's so boring. No, it's not so. Not really. If you think about how computers should figure this out, it's not. It becomes more interesting. This will shame the computers. Computers don't have the ability of our eyes and the kind of brain that we do have, and the way that eyes send the signal to our brain and process it, and we internally will know the solution. Computers don't have it. But so how does computers do it? So that is a question. Now let me clear this out. Clear these boundaries. And okay, so how does it? Remember, the first step is to choose K, and now it's quite obvious that there are 2 groups here, 2 clusters, and even though computer science doesn't know it, let's say that we know the solution based on expertise. We know the solution should be 2 clusters, so we will tell computer that K equal to 2. So what is step 2? Computers will randomly pick 2 points. To designate as the starting point of the 2 clusters. So I'm randomly picking 0, 3, and 0, 1, and let me use 2 colors to designate them. So what's 0, 3? Let me use black to indicate, and excuse my pen always does that. I'm using black to illustrate to represent this point, and I'm going to use blue to represent this point that I picked randomly. So blue. Alright, hopefully that's clear. Dark blue. Alright. So, computer picked these 2 points, and the idea is that hopefully these 2 points provide a good initial starting point for 2 clusters. But that's not really good. Ideally, computer would have picked 1 point from this cluster and 1 point from this cluster. However, the 2 points end up badly in one cluster, and they are not really too far away from each other. So that might be a bad choice. That might be a bad initial points. However, the true beauty of computer science, this algorithm K means cluster algorithm. The true beauty is that by following that by following the iterations, the computer will quickly derive the solution, even with bad picks. And here is to illustrate that. So let me use a red pen to write the solution. All right. So based on these 2 points, let's make a chart. So here is the chart. I have randomly picked 2 points. Point 1 is designated as center of cluster 1. It's 0, 3. A is 0, B is 3. And the second cluster has centroid 0, 1. A is 0, B is 1. Both of these points are on the B line. And I have put every of those 8 points on 8 rows. And the point here is to figure out what are the values of these 16 cells. These 16 cells should be the Euclidean distance between each point to the center of each of the 2 clusters. So let's do it. Now, in this process, I will go back and forth, like go back to the graph and come here to write the answer and go back and write the answer, because with the graph it's easier to figure out than simply using calculations. So the first point is the cluster 1 itself. So here, the cells here in these the purpose of this table is to calculate the distance between the point and the center of each of the cluster. So each of the cells should be the distance between the 2 target. The distance between this point and that point, let's go back. Distance between this point and that point is 2, and you can confirm that Euclidean distance is calculated like this: 0 minus 0. This is the number. This is the difference in value A and difference in value B. 3 minus 1 is 2, and take the square, and then take the sum, and then take the square root. It should become 2. This is 0, this is 4, take the square root is 2. Alright, I will do it quicker for the other points. Here, this point is interesting because it is a distance 1 with cluster 1, but also distance 1 with another cluster. And in the graph, this point is the second point. It's distance 1 between 2 groups, so it's kind of a tie. And for this point is exactly the cluster 2, so distance is 0, but the distance with the other cluster would be mirrored. And this point is also interesting because it's the same distance between, let's look at the chart. This point is same distance from the 2 cluster centroids, and the distance is square root of 2. Now let's do the other 4. Point 2, 0 and 0, 3. The distance would be 4 plus 9 is square root of 13. Distance between 2, 0 and 0, 1 would be square root of 5. Distance between 3, 0, 0, 3 would be, would be 3 and square root of 2. For easier comparison, I would put them in. 3 squared is 9, so square root of 11. However, the distance between here is 3 and 1 is very close, actually. Let me double check. Yeah. And this point 4 and 3, you know, it's 3, 4, and 5. And here the distance is 4 and 4 and 1. Take the square. 16 plus 1 is 17. Now for easier comparison, we would do square root of 25. The last one, 4 and 2, would be 2. Square root of 5 would be 4 plus 5 is square root of 9. And the distance of the 4, 1, and 0, 1 would be 4. And to make the comparison is square root of 16. Okay, now after calculating the distances, the next step is to decide which cluster does each point belong to. Now you should look for the shorter distance. You know, if the distance is shorter between the point and one of cluster, it should belong to that cluster. Or in other words, cluster will collect those points that are closer to them, and they will win over the other cluster from which the point is farther away. All right, so let's use the same color of the cluster to select those points that belong to them. Definitely this point 0 is smaller. This is the tie, so I'm going to randomly pick. Computers will do the same, will randomly assign, but this won't matter too much, and you will see why. The third point should belong to cluster 2. Here another tie, I'll just make a random pick here. It will belong to cluster 1. Here this point will belong to cluster 2. Cluster 2 is a very close call, but it belongs to cluster 2. Cluster 2 again, and nope, excuse me, I think I made some mistake here. I think I forgot how to calculate the combination here. So within the square root, when I combine them, I should multiply them instead of add them together. So square of 3 is 9. 9 multiplied by 2 is 18. And here, same thing. When I multiply 4 and 5, should be 20. And in that case, I should have the solution of this point to belong here. And all these bubbles, I should change the color to blue. Alright, there you go. Great. Now I have figured out that these 3 points should belong to cluster 1, and these 5 points should belong to cluster 2, based on the center of the 2 clusters and where the points lie. So the next step is to update the centroid because new members have joined. Previously, there's only one member in each cluster, and new points have joined the clusters. They are able to update the center of the cluster. So here it is. Here is the membership again to clean things up. And these points, based on their location, they should be able to update these centroids. And here are the updated centroid. You know, the A value of these points, the A value of the centroid should be, add these 3 numbers together, it's only 1 because these are 0, and divided by 3 is 1 over 3. It's close to 0.33, and you can check the other calculations. So after the update, because the membership, the clusters have changed, there is need to do iteration 2 to recalculate the distance and to update any membership, if any. So to see where these two updated centroids are, I'm going to write them here. There's a need to recalculate the distance and regroup them and recluster to see if there's any further change to the cluster membership. So here, in order to see, is 0.3 is close to here. Let me change it to black for this. 0.33 is here, but 2.33 is close to here. That's the center of the first centroid after update. And the centroid of the second, let me go back to check. The centroid is 2.6 and 0.4. 2.6 is close to 1, 2, 2.6 close to 3, but then the height on the B is a little bit here. Okay, so here are the two centroids, and by visually I will skip the calculation here because it's quite hard to manually do it, but visually it should be easier to find. And let me use green color to draw where the 4 points was. 3 points here and the 4 points here, and I have 2, 0, 3. I think I draw this 2, 4. No, that was right. I have 2, 0. I have 3, 0. Let's say 3, 0 is here. So 1, 2, 3, and 4, and 4, 1. So now, based on the updated centroids, it's not easy to visually confirm that these 4 points on the left, on the upper left-hand side, will be effectively in the second iteration. If you were to calculate the distance between the centroid and each of the point here. Why does it always do that? I don't know. These distances would be, favorable when it compare the distance between each of the point to the other centroid. So these 4 distances will be, the shorter end will be selected, and a new cluster will be formed here. And on the other side, you will visually confirm that the distance between the second centroid with these 4 points will be shorter than otherwise between each of these points to the first centroid. So visually confirm that second cluster is found, and computer has found the solution. What's left for the computer to do is that it will calculate, it will update the centroid by using the 4 points, because previously the 2 centroids are updated by in this case it's updated by 3 points, in this case updated by 5 points. And now, because of the slight change in membership, centroids will be updated slightly, but it won't change the next iterations. Iteration 3's membership won't change, and this will effectively end the algorithm. Computer solution worked, and it only used 2 iterations. And even with bad picks, if a computer were to pick a better initial centroids, it could have ended the solution by 1 iteration. by a bad pick, 2 iterations, and probably maximally 2 iterations is all that needed for such a small sample as an illustration. Alright, I hope that this this manual example showed you the power of cluster k-means cluster algorithm. It does has a lot of flexibility and capability in finding the clusters over a large sample. Now the next few slides will illustrate another problem with mostly the tables and visual cues, but even with a different set of points, the logic will be clear. The steps will be the same as I did manually. You know, I will leave it to you to read these and see how quickly computers figure out the right solution by using the simple steps of the k-means clustering. You know, just in a few steps, computers find the solution. And here in these slides, it showed you a very useful metric of how to figure out what might be the optimal value of k clusters. And this is very much data-driven approach. By using the variations and some abstract measure of cubic clustering criteria from the data, it will give you a hint about what might be the optimal k. This is a data-driven approach that proves to be quite useful, especially for very large data set. And as I said, I will skip talking in depth about hierarchical clustering in order to keep the video short. And so please, if you're interested, you know, read them by yourself in the slides and as well as the book. The book has good materials in going through in the example of different ways of doing hierarchical clustering. And if you have questions, make sure to let me know. All right. So the next task is for me to talk about hands-on a little bit. So for the hands-on demo, I won't demo here in the video, but I will refer you to the videos from previous semesters. And mostly, you know, the most useful video would be the fall semester of 2019. It goes through the census data set, k-means clustering example in depth, and shows you how to do the cluster profiling and how to interpret the results and graphs from profiling. But it did not show how to do how to import the data source of the census data. So for the data source part, refer to the spring 2019 video for data source configuration, you know, the variable rows and levels, and which one to use, which one not to use. And this is a longer video that has several components. And for the data source part, which is beginning of the k-means cluster demonstration, it starts about 40 minutes or so. So, you know, be sure to check it out. All right, in the third part, I'm going to briefly talk about homework. So the last homework of this semester has a few conceptual questions and a few hands-on questions about k-means clustering algorithm. Among the conceptual questions is a manual k-means clustering procedure that you will apply on a few simple points, like the way I demonstrated by hand in earlier part of this video, you'll do the same, and you will follow the same procedure, and the number of iterations are quite similar. You only need a couple iterations before the algorithm will stop, and then you'll demonstrate by hand how to do it. And in the process, you will draw similar tables, one table in each iteration to calculate the distance, and then to decide the cluster ownership, and then update the centroid and redo the table again the next iteration before membership don't change. And then the memberships being the same will indicate that the algorithm should stop. So that's the conceptual questions. In a hands-on question, you will apply k-means clustering algorithm to the serial data set. It's the same data set that you did in the regression homework, but now it's for a different purpose. So here's the very important part. Earlier in the regression homework, for the same data source, you did have to specify the target variable of rating, because regression model is a supervised learning method. But here, k-means clustering algorithm is an unsupervised method, so you cannot have a target variable. So remember, do not specify a target role for any of the variable, even for rating. And rating might be used, or I think rating should be used as one of the input variable here for this specific question. And so you will apply the k-means clustering algorithm, and I don't think you'll have any problem. And by the end, the last question in the hands-on part will ask you to profile the different clusters of cereal brands and cereal products. And after you have applied and run the cluster profiling, you will have something like this. So check this out. The question asks for 5 clusters, so you will have something like this. Let me enlarge this. In a cluster profile tool, you'll have these graphs that look like these, that plot on each of the cluster. This is, I don't know if you can see this, but let me read it to you. This is segment 5, segment 3, segment 2, segment 1, and segment 4. So for each of the segment, the profiling tool try to plot each of the informative variables against the population distribution as a hollow bar here, and the colors indicate the specific distribution for this specific segment or cluster. So by using the differences of the key variables across the clusters, or against the overall distribution of the cereal brands on this particular variable. This is sugar here, and it's clear to see that segment 3 here does have a lower sugar concentration. This is the histogram, and the highest bar here occupy the lower value of the range of sugars. So this brand or this cluster of cereals does have those brands products that have lower levels of sugars. So this is a clear distinction of this cluster against the overall population of cereals. If I look for another cluster and look for the sugar content here, this cluster, clearly most of the products occupy the higher end of the sugar content, so this tends not to be that healthy in terms of sugar. So these are the information that you will use to construct your description of each of the cluster. And let me show you one specific example of a cluster. And as your answer should be similar or conform to the format of this table, you will have 6 rows, and one row is the header. You have 5 rows for one row for each of the cluster, and you have 2 columns. The first column should indicate the cluster or segment number, and it should correspond to your screenshot of the cluster profile tool, the plots or an information. The cluster segment or the segment number should correspond to each other when you describe the cluster or the segment. And for segment 1, I provide you a simple example here. What should you write, or how should you construct the cluster profile or its description here? Cluster 1, you see sugars occupy mostly the lower end. Sugar, that's sugar. This may it's hard to read from this screenshot, but vitamin, it also occupy the lower end mostly, but vitamin doesn't have a huge range anyways. Calories, it mostly occupy the lower end. So you can see for most of these, this is iron, this is potassium. For most of these contents, if not for all of them, this cluster 1, the cereal brands in cluster 1 mostly occupy the lower end of most of the content, nutritious contents here. So you can say that in general, this cluster or this segment occupies a lower level of most likely all of the contents, including sodium, sugars, vitamins, calories, potassium, fat, and so on and so forth, and with only one exception, a relatively medium to high level of carb content. So mostly this cluster is quite healthy. You don't have to interpret whether or not this is healthy or not, but you only need to describe, relatively, how does this cluster of cereal products occupy in those key nutritious aspects based on the profiling tool. All right, so this ends this week's lecture video. I hope you enjoyed. See you next time.